Hello everyone. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, partners, sponsors and visitors to this very special event, which is the launch of version 2.2 of the National Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration in Australia. Kaya from Noongar Budja here in Western Australia. I'm Kingsley Dixon. I'm the chair of the Society for Ecological Restoration International. I'm a restoration scientist and also a restoration practitioner. It's an extraordinary honour to be emceeing this event today. As MC for the event, though, it's important to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. And we pay our respects and acknowledge their connection to country, which through what we will hear today on the restoration economy will be an emerging and new way of linking to country and to build a more robust Indigenous culture. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognise the many partners and sponsors who have supported the revision of these standards. And these are important people who have been with us on a very long journey. And as you can see, it's an impressive lineup of organisations that we have, and from NGOs to business, all the way through to important groups that have worked at the coalface and continue to work at the coalface of restoration. It's also important to recognise that with this launch, we are at a tipping point in Australia. 48% of the land area has been disturbed by the last 200 years of our activities. We now have the inspiring new carbon economy and the replanting of landscapes and extraordinary opportunities to link biodiversity, environmental benefits, rural and regional development, and Indigenous wellbeing on country through better and more focused restoration. Importantly, we're now seeing the co-stapling with carbon benefits of biodiversity. So these are exciting times, and it's the best time, I think, to be a restorationist in this country. So the order today is that we have the launch by the Honourable Susan Lee, Minister for the Environment. Before that, there's a very important person who has been instrumental in linking all of those partners and sponsors and in taking the standards and putting them within a contemporary vein, which is Teen McDonald. Teen will present the background to the genesis of these standards, and then there is a short video to be played which talks to the 6 key principles with what I think you'll find are some inspiring cases. Over to you, Teen.
Thanks, Kingsley. Yes, ecological restoration, as we know, is the process of assisting the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded, damaged or destroyed. And it's an honourable occupation, it's just that we wish we didn't have to do it. We do have to do it because of the human impacts upon ecosystems for the last few or more centuries particularly. These require us not only to conserve and restore, but we must reduce the impacts, the extinction impacts that we're making upon ecosystems. And the national standards were developed collaboratively because we need to ensure that restoration is practiced well and it's not misinterpreted. We need shared principles, a shared language and shared parameters. The national standards were prepared with input from 12 other Australian restoration organisations. The project was facilitated and edited by Sarah's Standards Reference Group. After our small beginnings in 2012, the group worked together and finally published the first edition as a special issue of Restoration Ecology in 2016. This formed the basis of the international SER standards published later that year. The second edition was launched in 2017 by Senator Anne Ruston, representing the Prime Minister in Parliament House, Canberra. That edition has now been revised in a minor way to include updates from the last international revision, as well as to include further clarifications that we hope will be useful internationally. So today we look forward to the Honourable Susan Lee, Australian Minister for the Environment, launching edition 2.2 of the National Standards.
But before we go back to Kingsley, who will introduce the Minister, let's have a look at illustrations of the 6 principles of the National Standards contributed by experts in their field.
Principle 1 of the National Standards is that ecological restoration practice is based on an appropriate, local, Indigenous reference ecosystem. The reference ecosystem is the local example we use to inform our work. When we practice restoration, we refer to the composition of local species, their structural configuration, and the ecological functions they display. For example, to best replicate the natural mosaic of local plant communities at our restoration sites, here in Gondwanalink, we undertake detailed soil sampling and vegetation surveys to best inform our work. We then build and assign seed mixes and seedling orders matched to specific soil types and landscape positions that correspond to the local plant communities. One of the joys of practicing ecological restoration comes from engaging with the natural ecosystems around you. Becoming more familiar with them and working to buffer, expand, and reconnect them is a fascinating journey of investigation, which is deeply rewarding. Keep it wild, everyone.
Principle 2 of the National Standards states that restoration inputs will be dictated by the level of resilience and degradation, meaning that the approach should be matched to the condition of the ecosystem. This diagram shows a range of ecosystem conditions that span from intact on the left to degraded on the right. The 4 restoration approaches are spontaneous regeneration, facilitated regeneration, combined regeneration/reintroduction, and reconstruction. These are applied according to level of degradation. These approaches can be grouped into reintroduction/reconstruction approaches, where components are imported, and regeneration approaches, where components are in situ or migratory. If you look at this as a landscape with a gradient of healthy to unhealthy condition, you'll see that it's not always uniform. That is, there can be patches suitable for a spontaneous regeneration approach in the more degraded parts of the landscape, patches suitable for facilitated regeneration where it is still generally in poor condition, and patches needing reintroduction or even full reconstruction towards the healthier part of the landscape. Across the spectrum of approaches, the range of appropriate treatments and the equipment used will be many and varied. The important thing is to select the approaches and treatments that match the level of degradation or resilience.
Principle 3 of the National Standards is recovery of ecosystem attributes is facilitated by identifying clear targets, goals, and objectives. An example of a target ecosystem could be this boxgum grassy woodland. It's important to understand the attributes or characteristics of this ecosystem or any other target ecosystem. Every ecosystem has physical conditions, species, structure, and provide lots of functions. Important to understand external exchanges and ensure there's an absence of threats in order to have effective ecological restoration. Once the target is agreed upon, then goals and objectives need to be established. A goal relating to the attribute of species composition, for example, might be to reinstate habitat for declining woodland birds. A specific objective would then be to reinstate 200 hectares of characteristic grassy woodland. In this case, a key indicator of success would be the presence of woodland birds using the new habitat over time. These clear targets, goals, and objectives are then the basis for effective monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation.
Principle 4 of the National Standards is: the goal of ecological restoration is full recovery insofar as possible. even if outcomes take long time frames or involve high input. The national standards urge us to aim for the highest and best level of recovery possible and reminds us that restoration is not a one-pass project. Full recovery is likely to take many years, if not decades, particularly when working at scale. But we can track progress towards project goals over time using the standards 5-star system. Here is an example of the standards recovery wheel tool, plus the before photos are part of a 600-hectare Numinbah conservation site. Works here employed assisted or facilitated regeneration, which has mainly consisted of large-scale weed control and some planting. And this is the exact same area nearly 10 years later, showing a huge improvement in many attributes. And here you can see those same 2 recovery wheels. As you can see, it's not yet reached the 5-star recovery level, but it's on a promising trajectory. In cases where constraints limit us even aiming for full recovery, a project can still be called ecological restoration as long as it involves substantial recovery of the local biodiversity.
Principle 5 of the national standards is restoration science and practice are synergistic. This means restoration practice draws from the knowledge and experience of practitioners in the field, as well as draws from science and also local and traditional communities. For example, in Kosciuszko National Park's former Snowy Scheme project, the restoration team has worked on up to 1 million cubic metres of tunnel rock in old quarries and construction sites to restore landscapes. This has required drawing on local knowledge about plants, animals, and climatic conditions at each site. We utilise best practice engineering and applied horticultural knowledge and assess sites in terms of ecological function to re-establish vegetation and habitat for over 60 vertebrate species. Monitoring changes over time has helped us confirm the current point of recovery in relation to our restoration goals. It is also generating new knowledge about recovering ecosystems. Science and practical application work well together, and together give enriched knowledge for improving practice by everyone, for everyone into the future.
Principle 6 of the national standards is that social aspects are critical to successful ecological restoration. And we've found through the well-planned ecological projects that we've run in northeast Tasmania that there's numerous employment, health and education benefits. So having more ecological restoration employment opportunities can address a whole lot of disadvantage indicators and benefit the environment at the same time. And it's absolutely essential that if we want to transition to a more ecologically sustainable society, we need to create livelihood and employment opportunities. Good work is fundamental to the human condition, and in the process of people participating in ecological restoration projects, there's the opportunity to cultivate a range of important ethical and cultural values, including acknowledging past land use mistakes, having a greater respect for nature, taking responsibility for the well-being of our natural heritage, having an increased understanding of how humans can positively impact on ecosystems, building a more restorative culture in the community, and having a more integrated community rather than a polarised one. Perhaps one of the most important social values of doing restoration is that it provides hope. If sustainability means anything, it means passing on the world in better shape than you found it. To participate consciously in the healing of ecological wounds is one of the most important actions for the 21st century and beyond.
Thank you very much, Teen, and thank you to our 6 presenters who so eloquently illustrated the great strides that we're making in ecological restoration. Now to the main event. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce someone I have great respect for. It's the Honourable Susan Lee, Australian Minister for the Environment, who will now officially launch edition 2.2 of the National Standards. Thank you, Minister.
Well, thanks very much, Kingsley. It's lovely to join you and Tian and members of your team and to look at that very informative presentation. Can I firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, their continuing connection to land, sea and community. Pay my respects to their cultures and their elders past and present. In my own electorate, we have, of course, Mungo, Lake Mungo, where the longest continual records of Aboriginal life in Australia are. So it's pretty extraordinary in Western New South Wales, not far from where I live in Albury. Can I thank the Society of Ecological Restoration Australasia for the invitation to be part of today's important event. And I'm very pleased to join you, Kingsley and Tian, and all the other contributing partners to mark the release of this latest edition of your National Restoration Standards. Can I acknowledge the Society for your role in positioning Australia as the global leader in restoration practice, having contributed to the first set of national standards that continue to bring enduring and lasting benefits to our natural environments. The updated standards deliver an invaluable resource to support the growing field of community practitioners engaged in environment restoration. So this update is both important and timely. Australia's unique wildlife, our natural landscapes and our marine environments sustain us, help shape our identity and in fact go to the heart of that national identity. It's never been more important that we rise to the challenge of rebuilding national environments in the face of bushfires, of floods, of habitat loss and changing climate, both here in Australia and across the globe. It's equally important that we can recognise that we're making a difference. We have, as you know, a long-term commitment to supporting habitat restoration and helping our threatened species and ecological communities. And I want to touch on a few things where I know your standards will be central, will be important, and will be used. The Threatened Species Strategy that was launched recently establishes a 10-year vision for the protection and recovery of threatened species and habitats and will be underpinned by continuing flagship programs and new initiatives. And our Regional Land Partnerships program has more than 120 projects targeting actions to improve and restore habitat for threatened species. We've tasked one of your partners, Greening Australia, with developing a 10-year strategy for the native seed sector. And dubbed Project Phoenix, this strategy will provide a coordinated approach to increasing the native seed and plant supply and to growing the capacity of the sector to better manage landscape restoration. And the investment we've made in bushfire recovery, I think, really brings to the fore the importance of the standards and the work that so many of your members do, because in investing $200 million in bushfire recovery for wildlife and habitat, that's been a complex task. We've involved local governments, we've involved community groups. They all want to achieve the outcome and achieve best practice. The standards, of course, enable them to get there. So to have something that's bespoke, perhaps in some instances, or across the board in others that they can pick up and use, I think really will make a difference going forward. We know that it's, as I said, it's never been more important to recognise the role of biodiversity on land, particularly following disasters such as the bushfires, but we're also focused on marine restoration. And some of you may know about the construction of 13 new shellfish reefs where we're partnering with the Nature Conservancy, our Reef Builder program. That's $20 million into shellfish reef restoration. And having visited a couple of the sites, you know, obviously partnering with the Nature Conservancy, we've got the conservation experts to inform how it's actually done. But I've also spoken to communities along the coast who say, well, we'd like to do this and how do we go about it? So having a set of standards absolutely will be part of informing that best practice. And it's been such a successful program, I'm looking forward to it continuing. We also announced a $100 million Oceans Leadership Package. I did that with the Prime Minister a few months ago. That's about blue carbon ecosystems, not just around Australia, but internationally as well. And the work that we're doing and we expect to do with blue carbon in the Pacific and you know, the work we continue to do with our Pacific family could also be well and truly informed by your restoration standards. So this is terrific. You've given me some new words. Kingsley, it was a restoration practitioner, but I think a restorationist, and I think that's a great word to to remember from today and for people to aspire to. So once again, can I congratulate Society for Ecological Restoration Australasia for updating and improving this valuable resource, for providing opportunities to strengthen the community of practice in this growing field of ecological restoration, and to support so many people and to be so willing to share your knowledge. And I look forward to hearing more about how these standards and this practice continues to inform the Australian Government's habitat restoration and biodiversity initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Extraordinary words and uplifting. And I think for Australia, we are on the cusp of a new era in rediscovering the values and the richness of this country through the restoration economy. So thank you very much on behalf of the Society and our membership and the 300 people who are online today, which is an extraordinary number. We extend our thanks for taking the time to launch these standards. Before we conclude, and I think it's very timely to reflect on probably one of the great fathers of restoration on the planet, E.O. Wilson, and he wrote some years back, "There can be no purpose more inspiriting than to begin the age of restoration, reweaving the wondrous diversity of life that still surrounds us." I think they're words that give us great hope and great comfort. The standards help us on that journey through best practice. And if you're in any doubt about that, stay tuned for the next 9 minutes as we conclude the official launch with 6 case studies of what we consider to be the most inspirational restoration in Australia, and will grow the body of restoration case studies into the future. So thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure being with you all today, and we look forward to working with all of you and all of our partners into the future. Thank you.
There are huge numbers of projects, restoration projects going on around Australia and the rest of the world, and it's almost impossible to select just 6 that might be examples of outstanding restoration. But these 6 projects will definitely inspire you by the ways that they engage with their stakeholders, draw on best practice and science, and are aspiring to the highest possible outcomes over time.
Our project is an Aboriginal-led project in northern Victoria, where we're restoring wetlands in the Kerang Wetlands Ramsar site, including the Karangi Marshes.
So it's about restoration, but it's also about our restoration as Aboriginal people, so we can start healing.
So far, we've had 32 traditional owners employed on these projects, out planting and guarding and doing weed control. We've planted over 40,000 plants, including the canopy trees, which are river red gum, black box and umong. And also a great diversity of medicine and food plants, things like water ribbons, nardoo and old man weed. So we've worked on over 1,000 hectares of wetlands and restored the tree canopy and understory diversity in that area. The plants are very palatable, not just to humans, but also to water birds. So those netting structures go up and stay for about 3 to 6 months until the plants get really well established roots and rhizomes, and then they can cope with a bit of grazing from the birds. Once established in these areas, which are nodes of diversity, the plants then spread their seed and can spread across the wetland.
Restoration is about us being able as Aboriginal people to get out and be a part of planting trees, part of making things grow. And our role is to bring it back.
Our project is addressing the loss of over 30 centimetres of sandy loam topsoil across 100,000 hectares of scalded duplex soils in the Marra Creek district of New South Wales, Australia.
This wind and water erosion, originally triggered by 19th century overgrazing, was causing massive siltation of the river systems. Now, this denuded landscape has no environmental life or function for the landholders. The water ponding method creates precisely surveyed and built 0.4 hectare ponds that retain 10 centimetres of rainwater. Now, this is just enough to produce deep cracking of the clay soil surface, and it is that which kick-starts the natural recovery. While the inside batter of the ponding bank is sown with Atriplex, Olney saltbush and curly Mitchellgrass seeds, it's the actual rainfall and the wind-blown native seeds that does the rest. To date, the Marrow Creek water ponding community has treated 42,000 hectares of scalded duplex soils with 84,000 water ponds. This has led to widespread recovery of native species and is a win-win for the environment and landholders. Now, the landholders have used their improved knowledge to better manage their rangelands for the long term.
Our project is located in the Big Scrub on the north coast of New South Wales, Australia. This once covered 75,000 hectares, but was rapidly cleared for dairying in the 19th century to just 1% of its former range. By the 1970s, the remaining 800 hectares of rainforest was highly fragmented and confined to less than 100, mainly small and ultimately unviable remnants. Big Scrub Land Care formed in 1993 and has undertaken extensive engagement with the community, particularly rural landholders. This, along with input from ecologists, bush regenerators, government grants and philanthropy, has allowed us and the community to invest over $3.5 million in restoring 45 remnants that were severely degraded by weeds, convert hundreds of hectares of weed-dominated regrowth back to secondary rainforest, and to plant 2.5 million trees, reconstructing 600 hectares of biodiverse rainforest. Because of a lack of genetic diversity in the planting stock, and we believe in the many very small populations of key species in the fragmented remnants, we are now investing in genome analysis of key structural species and up to 30 threatened species with the support of government, philanthropists and the community. This exciting science-saving rainforest program will inform the selection of the best propagation material for ongoing plantings. A future seed plantation created from these ideal genetic sources will ensure the reproductive potential of the new forests and optimise their resilience to climate change.
Like many parts of Australia, Buddaree National Park has suffered many mammal extinctions, and there is now a targeted translocation program to restore populations of several species. The translocation program is quite sophisticated. It includes a full risk assessment, then careful implementation of the translocation, coupled with well-designed monitoring, and then rigorous analysis of the field data that come from the monitoring. The final step is a reassessment of what worked and what didn't, and then an understanding of the lessons that have been learned. This strategy for translocations has been used in the case of the long-nosed potteroo, the southern brown bandicoot, and the eastern quoll. In each case, we've published the results of the translocation or reintroduction so that we can document the lessons that have been learned and how to do things better in the future. In this case, we've published a paper on the translocation of the southern brown bandicoot. We have plans for further reintroductions, translocations, including that of the southern greater glider, which has been extinct in the park since 2007. This is very much a collaborative project, with translocations occurring through partnership between the Australian National University, the NESP Hub, Parks Australia, the Wreck Bay Aboriginal Community, and WWF Rewilding Australia. Thank you very much.
Our project is called Operation Crayweed and is located in Sydney. Crayweed is a large seaweed that went extinct from the Sydney coastline in the 1980s, likely due to poor coastal water quality at the time. Back in the 1980s, sewage was discharged directly along the shoreline. In the 1990s, deep ocean sewage outfalls were installed and water quality improved dramatically. Despite this, crayweed did not re-establish in Sydney. In 2011, we launched Operation Crayweed with the goal of reversing local extinction and bringing crayweed back to the Sydney region. We have developed an effective restoration method that harnesses the power of seaweed reproduction. We set up underwater plots and transplant crayweed from nearby populations in a way that stimulates seaweed sex and kickstarts new populations that are now expanding into new territories. We have successfully restored crayweed to 7 sites in Sydney. We're working on another 9, and all of these while also engaging local communities and raising awareness about the importance of our local seaweed forests. We plan to continue adding restoration sites until we have successfully re-established crayweed to the entire Sydney metropolitan coastline, where it used to thrive.
The opportunity we're seizing is that despite extensive land clearing and fragmentation across the southwest, the southern area has most of the big bits of habitat. It's across the climate gradient. It's got strong and willing communities trying to make a difference, and we're just helping them all come together and make a bigger change than they can individually. 25, 30 different groups involved, huge number of landholders and local traditional owners, and much of it's already under traditional owner management with the Naju Conservation Group. It is all coming together to a much bigger change. In the habitat gaps, around 16,000 hectares of pretty marginal farming land has been secured and restored between the national parks and restored ecologically to an ever-increasing standard. And it's incredibly exciting to see wildlife returning to what had been bare areas. But perhaps even more significant, we know we've built the organisational and scientific and technical foundations that much bigger changes can happen from. It is possible to have ecologically healthy communities where mining, farming, wildlife, traditional owners coexist in a genuine and healthy balance. We're really proud to be a founding 50 project for the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration and looking forward to be an active part of generation restoration.